Okay, wait 1 second. Okay, try anyone else start speaking. Would the main video be shown like, will the main video be shown is your face
Hi
or
guys,
will it
this is
still be the timer?
guys. Has the debate started here?
Okay, hello. Do I start?
Okay, wait. I think I don't know how to make this like screen sharing work.
Guys, the
So is it
webcam is
okay
up,
if
so if
everyone
you
just
yeah.
times also?
Hi, Tasia. So
Yeah.
you can just go to Google and share your search for a timer and share the screen over there. It'll be fairly easy. Yeah.
Okay,
Rishi, can you
cool.
please help?
Yeah, sorry. What do you guys need?
They need help with sharing the screen for the timer.
Okay, just give me a second.
To start the debate. Yeah. Okay, wait. I think I don't know how to make this like screen sharing work.
Right.
Guys, the
So is it
webcam is
okay
up,
if
Three.
so
everyone just
Am I heard?
times also?
Just want to make sure
Hi,
that I'm heard.
Tasia. So
Yeah.
Hello.
you can just go to
Yep.
Google
All right.
and share your search for a timer
3,
and share the screen over
2,
there.
1.
It'll be fairly easy.
Ladies
Yeah.
and gentlemen, no matter how
Rishi,
good
can you please
Alicia,
help?
like AOC is good, for example, or like how a lot of like youth
yeah,
politicians
sorry.
like
What do you
rise
guys
from the
need?
ranks of youth wings, they'll
They
never
need
be able
help
to
with
control the
time,
agenda within these
sharing the
political
screen
parties
for
that
the
are
timer.
controlled by older and white men
Okay,
that do not
just
have
give
the
me a
same
second.
interests as them and people who have
Start the
tied to
debate.
corporations,
Yeah.
for example. What is the I want to note like 3 key pieces of framing for this debate, right? What is the goal of this debate? The first is note that in order for you to enact some change within the party, you have to control the party
Okay, wait. I
agenda.
think
You have to be the leader, for
I don't know how
example.
to
Or
make this
secondly, you
like
have the
screen
majority of
sharing
people to support
work.
you
Right.
within that party in
So
order
is
for
it
you
okay if
for them to
everyone just
support their cause.
times
So it
also?
does not
Just
you
want to
don't
make
you
sure
Hi,
can't
that.
just
Tasia.
have like
So
one ally
Hello.
within
you can
that's
just go to
young
Yep.
Google
that also has the same
and
view as you, but you also have to
share
have
your search for
majority
a
of people
timer
who
and
is willing
share
to
the
push
screen
that
over there.
agenda
It'll be
all the
fairly
way
easy.
up to the top of the ladder. Because notice
Good
it's the
Alicia,
leader that's
like
able to, for
AOC is
example,
good, for
dictate
example,
what
or like
agendas
how a
and
lot
what
of
we're
like youth
campaigning and like where
politicians
do we
like
allocate
rise from the
resources
ranks.
and what are we gonna present to the public. And without those two things, you're unable to get any change. The third thing to note is we think that broad change will be hard for both sides, right? This will be incredibly difficult because primarily because they're young, but at least we're gonna say that it's marginally better off on our side and you get more change in comparison to theirs. But also in a worst case scenario that we don't get any change, at least we have safe space for the youth, for example, when we create their own wings, right? So what is our model? Our model is threefold. The first is that we're willing to abolish these youth wing parties, meaning to say that no wing party can have their own youth wing, which they just use, for example, to come for campaign purposes, etc. Instead, we'll funnel the money in and to an independent group who will allocate like to who will like pick a host of youth groups to pick from and create their own party, and all of the youth now has to go to those parties in order for them to enact any change. Note that when we're talking about youth parties, these are not like children. These are people who are above the age of consent, for example, and who can run and who people who can commit themselves to the parties as well, like full time. So we're like looking at people who are aged from 21 to 30. We think that these are people who can push for their own agenda, etc. So to the first argument, right? So why we think that we create a safe space for these youth, right? So note that in the status quo, they cannot have this because the main norm is for them to go to these youth wing, like youth wing political parties, because the majority of people tell them that you go there instead, or like if like for example there's 100 of them, like 50 of them go to these youth wing parties instead of creating their own, which is incredibly daunting, for example, to create your own political party. So note that this creation of the youth political parties can only be enacted by a government that abolishes all other alternatives in order for them, for example, to go into these parties and to make sure that they create their own party, etc. So what is the problem, right, within these youth parties? Note note that in these groups, right? Like a lot of these politicians like cast away a lot of these the concerns of children. Why is this the case, right? Because the first is because there's respectability politics within this body, right? So it's like it's the saying that I'm older than you and I have more experience than you and you're just a kid and that's why we shouldn't listen to you. Or the second is the fact that I have more status and I have legit like political power and ability, for example, to control the agendas of an old white man, means to say that I can label your issues as less important primarily because of that power. So note that in status quo, a lot of youth are unable to talk about things that are important to them, i.e. the environment, right? Which for a lot of old people, for example, seem like far, far away and it's not that important compared to jobs. Or like, for example, the huge student debt, which allows a lot of people to work like corporate slaves throughout their lives and it's not fixed by Congress in any way. Or for example, like the increasing rise of depression, anxiety, and of like people committing suicide among like teenage population. These are things that are increasingly sidelined day by day, and we cannot afford this lack of safe space. What do we do, right? So on our side, when we abolish these parties, note that they're all forced to create their own party, and we think that this whole party of like youth people is important because of two reasons. The first, because when you control everything within, we think that you when all the people are youth, come from the youth section, right? We think that that's when you have a lot of people who have the same empathy as you because they can recognize the same like problems that you have and they've been all through that process and therefore they can like empathize more with what happened to you, i.e. if you had student debt, for example, or if your family if you think that the whole world will collapse because of the environmental like the poor environmental change, right? Or but the sound reason is the reason why the safe space is important is because not in status quo that children and the youth, right, have to act differently, right? They have to act like adults. They have to act in a certain way. They have to act really, really formally. So note that this body policing that comes in everyday scenario in this youth groups means to say that they're unable to fully like be free within those organizations because they've always have to act within a certain norm, or else they'll be punished as rowdy, for example, or they'll be told as they're like simply being kids and not being formal, etc. Which means to say that they don't get to freely express who they are within those institutions. But for that, yes, closing.
Right. What if young people believe that their best interest is actually to work within the existing political party?
Even if that is the case, right, I'm gonna prove why you're unlikely to get any change in those scenarios. Okay. Sorry, I'm just finding my paper. Okay. So So note that in status quo, like a lot of the youth aren't able to get their change, right, in youth wings because of three reasons. The first is because they're only used as props, right? Like for example, when there's a campaign, they're mainly used as bodies who send flyers or to talk right along with the politician. So they're mainly seen as like a force in order to draw more votes from the other people. But the sound is that they don't have real power from within. They don't have access to funds and they don't have any leadership, right? Because like mostly like the people on the top are people who have already long experiences, for example, or have the most votes among the majority of like adults, and therefore they gain that power. Or the fact that they have a lot of ties with corporations is the reason why a lot of adults are more willing, for example, to put them in those leadership roles. This is why this is why the exceptions of AOC, which is an exception in the rule of like a lot of youth individuals who have tried to push for change, does not mean to say that the change is already likely from within. What is the counterfactual, right? When you have organizational leadership, and that's mainly from like the person who is in the top is a young person, you are able to do four things. The first is you're able to allocate resources into your own like youth leadership. Meaning, say you have more people like AOC running because all of the funds are allocated to young people to run. But secondly, is because you're able to prioritize the issue. You mean to say that instead of like thinking of like adult things like the economy, etc., you get to prioritize more things like suicide of teens, for example, or the environmental collapsing, because you can control what is discussed within within that institution. But the third is because you're able to reflect, for example, with the majority of people that the leadership role is now controlled by the youth. You energize a lot of people who believe that for at least this time there will be change. Note that on our side, we have more campaigning and more awareness about youth issues, and we think that's a first step in terms of making sure that we have political change in the long run. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Now I would like to invite the leader of opposition to start the case from side opposition. Here.
Yeah, hi. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Just give me 20 seconds. I'll begin. Yeah. So I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Panel, at the end of opening our Prime Minister's speech, at their best case, youth can achieve some degree of marginal change outside the political system. We will tell you how it's crucial for young people to be involved within the mainstream political system in and of itself, and youth wings are an essential and unique mechanism which enable them to do this. 3 things in my speech. Why the youth wings of political parties provide young people access and buy-in into mainstream systems of political power, why these political youth wings have a unique ability to achieve several beneficial political ends which the upper echelons of these very parties and the other mainstream political bodies don't really do, and lastly why in the absence of political youth wings, something with the comparative that OG has absolutely not engaged with, we think young people are proselytized into politics in much more nefarious means. Now, firstly, in terms of one extraneous rebuttal to OG's speech, first, notice how they don't defend the principle of the motion, rather they just defend a different version of young people being involved in politics through their own political parties or through independent student-led movements. I'll break down both of these alternative mechanisms. First, in terms of independent student-led movements, as we've seen in Hong Kong, for instance, we think that given that they don't given that they can't affiliate themselves with political and legal protections of unionization of being members of a political party, whenever they go out to protest on the outside, for example, whenever they advocate on social media, it's much more easier for the establishment to crack down upon them as anti-national or secessionist or subversive movements who should be jailed and thrown behind bars because they're engaging in some nefarious subversive political propaganda. It's much more harder for the establishment and the state to do this against youth wings of political parties who have the right to unionize, who have the right to protest in the streets because they have those legal protections already in place. Secondly, in terms of independent political parties, we simply think that these independent political parties will not be able to develop the necessary political capital to ever form majority governments or even acquire a decent amount of seats or even get elected in the first place unless OG tells us how, and therefore not be a crucial player in the system regardless. Coming to our case now, youth wings provide access to young people into systems of political power. Political parties in general, and this is where we agree with OG to some extent, are largely dominated by old elites. This is due to 2 reasons. First, that there's a considerable amount of time that you need to build the necessary political image and financial resources to fight elections. And second, that voters generally tend to trust leaders who they perceive to have more experience, which is why we don't think these independent political parties will also be voted into. Due to these structural factors, young people simply don't occupy political positions of power, such as in the legislature. Why is this bad? We think that this is bad, firstly because the narratives and policies that the old establishment continue to perpetuate simply continue as a vicious cycle. And this is crucial. And this is crucial because young people are the ones who are going to be impacted by these very policies for the longest amount of time, because they have the longest amount of time left to live within those very political systems. And therefore, they face consequences of these for a longer period of time. How do they then gain access to these political positions of power within the mainstream through political youth wings? First, we think that youth wings are often breeding grounds from which existing political parties scout and select leaders for their own future. They have an incentive to do this because they recognize the fact that their old white male leaders simply can't cater or gain popularity among these youthful vote banks who often form vast proportions of the population, and therefore it's crucial they have a political incentive to attract that vote bank within their fold as well. This is why they often select young leaders from these youth political movements as well, give them tickets to fight elections, and if they win, they often end up in the legislature also. We've seen various examples of this. For example, in India, across the political spectrum, we noticed this. Kanhaiya Kumar was a member of the National Students Union of India, which is an affiliate of the Communist Party of India, and he later fought the general elections from the state of Uttar Pradesh as well. The same goes for the complete opposite spectrum as well. Tejasvi Surya was a member of the Akhil Bharatiya Vidya Parishad, and today he's a member of parliament from Bangalore, a major city, and furthering his political propaganda because his advocacy, because he was first a member of a student wing of a political party, which gave him necessary political capital to fight elections and gain legitimacy. Before I tell you why youth wings can achieve unique political ends and why the comparative is much worse on government side, does the closing have a question?
Yeah, considering the fact that most people who go to these youth wings are politically involved anyway, otherwise they wouldn't go there, what is your delta in getting their buy-in into politics?
I think the delta lies in them accruing the benefits of political organization. As long as they fight as long as they try to gain political legitimacy through independent movements on their own parties, we think it's much harder for them. They have to endanger themselves to things like police brutality, crackdowns upon them, being banned from social media, things of that sort. We think all of this is much harder to do through youth wings of political parties who already have that political legitimacy and legal protection. Therefore, then it's simply easier on our side for young people to get into politics through these wings, and that's a good thing. Now, in terms of achieving unique political ends, we think firstly, youth wings can further much radical political discourse. This is true for those youth wings who represent moderate mainstream political parties as well. The upper echelons of mainstream and moderate political parties as well are simply chained by the interests of their vote banks, who are often conservative because they consist of older people, or simply because and therefore they can't go against their interests. However, the youth wings of these political parties are often the ones who further radical political discourse, because the vote bank that they are catering to, young people, are usually consist more of liberals or people who are generally open to more new ideas, which is why they further political discourse. Therefore, in India, while the Congress party is not openly criticizing the Hindutva of the BJP, it's the youth wings of the Congress party who are driving student-led movements against citizenship law, calling out the Ayodhya temple, things of that sort. And that's where the real opposition is coming from. And we would like to maintain this. Second, we think that young people take up youth issues themselves, which political parties never take interest of, and then get them into the political mainstream. So in India, during Indira Gandhi's rule, student protests began from high canteen prices in public schools and colleges, which led to protests against Indira Gandhi's reign of terror in general. On the comparative, and this is something we'll deal on second speech, we think that young people be proselytized by much more nefarious means into politics, because political parties still have an incentive to attract them, and that's something that OG has to defend. For all these reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Now I would like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello. Is my mic clear, or can you hear some buzzing noises? Hello?
Yep, it's clear.
All right. Just give me a second. I'll get my timer. I prefer POIs through chat since I can see them anyway, so please don't badger. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Before I go into the deeper issues of the debate, let me just recharacterize how opposition was fairly unresponsive to the three key framings my previous speaker has dealt with, right? There are things that are in constraints in society, such as having a large bias against youth, or having the lack of trust within youth individuals in participation in legislation. And third, in most cases, there are oftentimes collusions among adults that deprioritizes the agenda of the youth. These are things that promulgate the concept that opposition wants to forward so legitimately on the concept of how it's going to bring about more legitimacy or more traction for youth, right? I'm going to prove to you in my speech why the safe space in promoting a more independent political party is a much better alternative. And secondly, I'm going to prove why in the long run, this is more sustainable when you talk about the intergenerational effect and the presence of elections in and of itself, right? So before I go into the main extensions, let me first go into key rebuttals, right? Understand that opposition's case into this debate thus far says that what if ideologies are aligned with the political party? Are we going to go in the event that we ought to not let them join just because they are the youth? Understand that ideologies in and of itself are equally diverse, right? There are things that even if you're part of the youth party, you can promulgate the concepts of liberalism, or you can promulgate the concepts of being conservative, right? These are things that are not mutually exclusive, that things that op could get, right? Because if they want to so promulgate about the concepts ideologies, the main fact that we have diverse political parties in status quo just enacts upon the fact that we can ought to afford different types of variations of it with just different goals set aside. If we prove to you that at the end of the day, the youth's interests will never be aligned with this umbrella political party, it is something that we ought to take into account to make an independent party as an alternative, right? But second rebuttal, right? They tell us that this promotes more access and buy-in to unique political agenda, right? Understand it is an extraneous example to give about Hong Kong protesters who are youth, right? Understand whenever you dissent among against the government, there will always be consequences that people, or the harms that will bring about, harm, right? But on the third level, right, when opposition tells us that this is fairly important, because you have to take into account that we have to have an avenue where the youth will be constantly listened to, right? Understand that these are things that they were not able to mechanize when they failed to engage in the framing that there are a lot of existing biases that already existed in status quo. So when I go into my constructives, first I'm going to re-mention why my previous speaker's speech was so important, right? Understand, Marx so argued on the concept of having more safe spaces in the political agenda. This impacts comes in threefold, right? First, it comes into diverse prioritization agenda. Understand why this is such a unique policy is because understand that the youth in current context have different prioritizations. They may have different prioritizations in terms of environment, in terms of having to solve issues like school debts, or having more prioritizations for college students in general. These are things that are always taken a back seat, right? When you promote more diverse prioritization of gender, this promotes to more lobbying for actual legislative change, because understand why opposition was not able to provide a tangible benefit of it is because there's no existent examples in status quo where there's constant lobbying for actual changes in terms of changing student debts, or actual changes in addressing more environmental concerns that are more targeted to what the youth needs, right? But on the second impact, it incentivizes more youth participation. Understand that in the best cases in most countries, there are times that of course the youth will be prioritized, right? But in most cases, and especially in conservative societies, in traditional settings, the youth always takes a backseat, and more often than not, they don't have the initiative to join into political legislation. This is very important because when you talk about having the privilege to actually have the platform for yourself, you're more able to centralize the discussion to what the youth actually needs, right? So in cases that when it talks to legislative change, it is more often than not, this is going to be the converse of the discussion and the ultimate priority. On the third level, right, understand that in the umbrella party, when you tell us that it is in preparation for the youth and training, right, understand that in any political agenda that happens in society, there are things that we ought to consider that is fairly different from youth agenda versus the agenda of the majority of the political parties in society, right? But on the second extension, right, understand that why is it better in the long term, right, in the future? Because understand that in our model, we ought to see that the number of growing support are things that are going to be apparent, right? It's going to look like the youth actually garnering more traction and more support on the basis of their principles and the basis of what they're fighting for. Because obviously, understand that these are things we have to address in society. The issues that that opposition wants to lobby for are things that already are being lobbied for in current society, right? So in the first impact, understand that there is more support or in a more intergenerational effect. Understand the unique feature of political parties is that in the event that the youth no longer wants to advocate for youth agendas or politics, they could easily shift to more different political parties, right? So this looks like having more incentive for the youth to participate on the mere premise that they want to address issues that the youth are facing, right? Understand that in the second impact, this creates an overtone window for more middle ground discussions, right? In cases that you are ultimately more prioritizing of like youth concerns versus deprioritizing the actual concerns of people in other political parties, you're more likely to create a middle ground discussion wherein more likely or not, you're going to collude to actually something that is more tangible in society, right? In cases that students want to offer more prioritization in student debts, often or not, these are things that are going to be up in the table for discussion and legislative change, right? So look into the comparatives, right? In the best case scenario of op, they say that this is the best grounds for training and is aligned with their interests. Look, this is something that opening government has considered as a worthy trade-off, because understand that interests completely change in the get-go, right? The youth can participate in these political parties in the future, but in the cases that we ought to prioritize the most immediate concerns of the youth, these are things we get to solve in opening government side, right? Understand that in their worst case scenario, the youth will always take a back seat or will always be in the premise of having to collude with adults just for the fact that they want to receive more legitimacy, and it's a far worse negative in society. On our side, you get the benefit that you get is the possibility for legislative change. These are things that are fairly important because these things are not even incompatible to mechanisms that opposition has. In our worst case, even if we don't get that legislative change, at least we get to promote more safe spaces in the event that the youth actually wants to participate in political parties or want to participate in politics in general. Never been prouder to propose.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for that speech. To continue the debate, I would like to call the Deputy Leader of OP. Here.
Yeah, am I clearly audible?
Yeah.
I'll just start. Give me like 20 seconds. Right. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, before I move on to further the case from side, which has come from side opening opposition, I think it's important to look at what came from side OG, right? Couple of rebuttals with respect to that before I move on. Firstly, I think primarily they lack a justification as to why the youth deserve such a power and influence that they talk about, right? Firstly, they don't provide us a justification for the same. Secondly, they go on to tell us and suggest a model where they are trying to provide this power and influence outside of the political spectrum by being like an independent outlier to the system which is present in status quo, which we find problematic and honestly not enough a reason to abolish youth wings in the first place, right? Like, we don't think it satisfies that the metrics on which this debate operates today, right? Second thing that came from side opening opposition, opening government, is the need for a safe space to be created. Here again, there's an important link that's missing, right? They never told us why this safe space is so crucial to politics in general, right? Like, they tried to tell us things like the youth will feel the youth will feel there'll be more participation coming from the youth. They'll feel more interested in activities, right? But that falls out when you have when you have a majority section of these youth students who are already interested in the political spectrum and are already willing to take that opt-in into the system, right? So when that happens, we don't understand what the importance of this safe space being created actually looks like, right? Thirdly and lastly, they talk about how there will be no change in our world because these youth wings will now just be used as foot soldiers of these political parties, right? We don't understand what is wrong being political foot soldiers before they are able to gain the experience, traction, and capital which is required over the years in such a field like politics to actually get some change, right? It is not an overnight change that any of this house should be debating about. It is a long-term shift towards more liberal. It is a long-term shift towards more younger leaders in the future, which should be the goal of this house to begin with, right? What have we told you on side opposition? We've given you two metrics here today on which you judge the debate, right? Firstly, on which side is youth politics better? On which side is this contested better? On which side do you have more healthier participation? And secondly, on which side is politics in general looking better for that particular country, right? I give you the comparative and tell you how we do a much better job at satisfying these metrics on side opposition. In government's best case, they want the formation of these smaller youth parties which are separated from these bigger political parties which exist, right? We have a few problems with that. Firstly, that we feel like it is much tougher to gain the kind of influence and political traction for these independent and new upcoming parties to gain in democracies where there is already a multi-party system, or even worse, where there's a bipartisanship, right? We feel like it is going to be extremely difficult for them to pierce that wheel and get the kind of political traction they require. While doing this, if they tell us this is a long-term move that they're looking for, we'll tell you that there'll be more instances of students starting off in these kind of political parties, either losing interest of politics altogether because they are not seeing any sort of change come about in the 1 year or in the 2 years that they're affiliated with this organization. And more importantly, secondly, they will never be able to gain the kind of power and influence that they talk about, because although the youth is a major chunk of the vote bank, we don't think it is enough for these political parties to expect to win the elections solely banking that they'll be able to bag each and every vote of the youth in that particular country, right? Plus, added with that, the problem being that there'll be a lot of these youth parties coming about, creating competition within themselves in and of itself. So you will never have one particular political front which is actually questioning higher authority, which is something they ideally want, right? So in their best case, they do not fulfill the criteria of having like youth parties creating a safe space which they haven't justified in order to ever effectuate the change that they want to get, right? And secondly, we tell you on the comparative, in our worst case, what we can do on opposition is simply aim for better political integration, right? Like there's a reason why the youth feel disconnected from politics in a lot of even in a lot of liberal democracies around the world, right? Because there's certain gaps that need to be fulfilled. There needs to be better integration programs, right? So that looks like a much better alternative than completely getting rid of youth wings to begin with for this reason in and of itself, right? Secondly, we tell you that in a case where closing opening government hasn't really done this, but in a case where closing government were to come up and tell us that there is a risk of these students and the youth falling prey to political doctrination, to falling prey to political brainwashing, we tell you that even if they were to make this argument on their best case and tell you how the world will look bad because now you'll have a bunch of students going around being brainwashed by radical organizations, we tell you that the chances of this are much worse in the absence of these youth wings, right? There is no kind of check and balance that the political system will have any longer on their largest vote bank. And secondly, we tell you that there is the harms of things like social media and other radical groups who can easily influence the stakeholder in question, right? So the fear of indoctrination, etc., are much worse even in their best case, right? Two more things before I move on to that. I'll take a POI from closing. Go.
So since majority of the youth are not in youth wings of political parties, how would you get them to buy in and care about politics since they are the biggest stakeholder in the debate?
All right. We feel that youth in general are interested in politics, but we can't equate them to the same level at which we equate a 40 or 50-year-old politicians, right? Which is to say that there are expectations from the next generation in politics or in any other sector of the economy, but we tell you that it is this transition from being a rookie to being a seasoned politician is going to be a much better when you have like a grooming stage of these politicians within the system, which is to go through the youth wing of that party. We've told you that the buy-in that you're talking about, we don't think it's going to be as difficult as you talk about it. We tell you that it's much easier to get a membership into the youth wing of a political party through like the affiliate institute that you're going to, right? Like it's as simple as that. We don't think the buy-in is so high that we should even think about abolishing it. Two more problems we have with the comparative, right? They've told us that there'll be no consideration for youth needs, simply because the youth don't have enough influence, their whatever problems that they have will go to waste. Right? We tell you that there is a more likelihood of this happening in their world than ours, right? Because at our worst case, you will still have a youth wing of that political party still questioning, writing emails, writing letters to people in higher authority within the same party about the problems that they might be facing or their vote bank might be facing, right? This happens simply because the youth wing acts as a link between the youth vote bank and the political and the people in power in that political party, right? Whenever this crucial link is missing, we feel like the needs of the youth is lost in translation, right? And it'll be lost completely when you're propounding to form organizations which just do not have enough capital, which just do not have enough experience, which will never have the capability in the near future to get the kind of change you want. Gov falls out of this debate, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of OP, for that speech. To start the debate from the closing house, I would like to invite Member of Government Yaya.
Hey, am I audible?
Yep.
All right. So starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Two main points of extension. Firstly, breaking down the main crash on the top half about where do we get better representation of youth, particularly to be clear on our extension here. OG give a nice alternative of youth maybe opening an alternative party, which got a lot of rebuttals from OO. We're going to take OO at their best and show why even if youth are not going to change their voting patterns, the political parties themselves are going to have a stronger incentive to cater to youth groups after the motion. Second point of extension will be on political tribalism and why it's terrible. One point of extension rebuttal, the rest will be integrated. So to the last thing that we've just had from the DLO in preemptive of, but the alternative to this political tribalism and brainwashing is going to be a black market of tribalism where they still talk politics, but there are no checks and balances, etc. Two things on that. A, assertion, no idea why, how it looks like, why it is likely that this is such a wild environment on the web. But secondly, even if this is the case, checks and balances sounds in this particular context like a very washed term for actual brainwash and biases. Because who does the checks and balances? The political party itself. They want to determine the regulations and how the discussions look like within the youth wing is the political party, which obviously have an incentive to make you even more brainwashed, more biased, etc. So we don't think that these are good checks and balances. Let's go into the points. Let's start with where do we get better representation of youth? And I want to take several things off the table because some things just don't change under the debate. First thing that doesn't change under the debate. These particular youth, the ones who are currently in youth groups, are going to be politically informed and voting. This is very likely because they already clearly have a strong political opinion. They have a very strong buy-in to that because they invest a lot of their free time in this political youth wing, and because they probably already identify with that so much. They probably have friends within it, etc. So they're not likely to just be the sort of people who don't join politics in the first place with the absence of it. These are the people who already had political opinion. At this point alone, OO doesn't have any unique impact or delta under that side of the debate. Second thing that doesn't change under the debate is that politicians have some incentive to get youth to vote for them. This is for three reasons. Firstly, because youth voters are easy to sway more than the older voters that have already voted for the same party for a few decades. Secondly, because youth voters have the lowest turnout, so it is the incentive of politicians to actually reach for them more because they view them as a target audience that needs to have increased turnout. And thirdly, because this is a long-term investment. This is someone that is going to vote for you for the rest of their lives in most likelihood for many years to come. However, what happens today and why do we fix it tomorrow? We think that today politicians cater exclusively to the already buy-in youth, to the ones who are already inside these youth wings. There are several reasons for this to be the case. Firstly, the ones like the youth themselves are likely to be more in their own hive mind of talking with each other about politics rather than actually burden themselves with trying to talk with other people about politics, because it is easier. They get an echo chamber within this party, etc. And the counterfactual, because they would still be interested, but they will not also be so concentrated in one youth wing. They will have a strong incentive to actually reach out to other people, talk to their friends from university, to their girlfriends, to whoever is in their close environment about politics, and actually increase buy-in in the rest of their peers. Secondly, because politicians, target audience right now with a high likelihood to vote. They know that since they have youth wings, it is best for them to go for the ones that are already voting, because most politicians care more about the primaries rather than the general elections. They don't care so much about getting more voters for the party. They mostly care about getting more votes for themselves within the party. So they go to the ones that already vote, because they know that these are the ones that are most likely to actually participate in primaries and cater to them, which is obviously mutually exclusive with going to universities, to societies, to clubs, to actually talk with the general youth, because now they have a concentrated group to focus on. Tomorrow they will be forced to actually reach out to a wider population. Thirdly, because just in terms of rhetoric, they are likely to use the sort of jargon that is often used within these youth groups and actually be kind of foreign themselves from the rest of the youth that are likely to feel like they are not approachable to them. And lastly, because in the primaries policies, the policies to be promoted by politicians that want youth to vote for them are likely to be the ones that the youth wings in themselves promoted rather than what the general youth want. And secondly, because now youth groups are going to be forced to actually voice their opinions in the general party more often, because now they don't have this echo chamber in which politicians listen to them. They have to go out to the actual meetings of the general party where they actually talk to more politicians, more people involved, etc. Why is this important? Aside from this actually proving the premise of OG that we get better representation of youth, we think this wins top hat for the following reasons. We help all the youth, not only the ones that are already politically informed. This is important for three reasons. Firstly, just in terms of quantity, more people, because most people in this debate are not the ones who are already within the youth groups. Secondly, the most unique delta in this debate, because the youth are not going to change, but our population does. And lastly, the less privileged populations, because we think that the ones who already participate in youth wings are likely to be the more privileged ones, who have a lot of free time, who can afford this, or have political education from the get-go, and therefore the policies they support in the first place are less representative of the poorer youth people who get represented only on our side. Go. See you then.
Right. If it's true that that this motion doesn't create a change in the degree of interest of people, how many more people will be interested in politics? Why does it create a change in the extent to which the people who are interested are going to do things like campaign? Wouldn't they do it anyway?
No, I just explained that they have a stronger incentive, given mutual exclusivity of funds and time, to focus most of the resources, especially when there's also mutual exclusivity in policies, because these often are groups that support different policies. It means that now politicians have more of an incentive to actually cater to the larger group rather than to the smaller but more activist group. Cool. Let's talk briefly about tribalism. We think that generally what happens uniquely in these groups is A, you have a very strong echo chamber. B, the fact that you form your identity around it because you're fairly young, you get to know most of your friends, perhaps your significant other within this. Thirdly, the fact that you feel not on par with the MPs that come to talk to you because they are not the same age as them. They have like this authority sort of depiction when you feel so blessed by, oh, I'm such a unique youth, I'm actually getting to talk with politicians, etc. This is and of course you're less critical and nuanced because you're younger. This is the point at which you're more likely to actually connect your identity to the party that you are part of the youth wing for, making you less critical of them, making you less likely to actually hold them accountable when they maybe do things that you disagree with. We think that this leads to the fact that in the future, you're less likely to actually listen to the other side, more likely to hate at anyone who hates on your party. For all those reasons, beg you to propose.
Thank you, Member of Government, for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the Member of Opposition. Here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Thank you, the member of opposition, for that speech. Now I'd like to invite the government whip here.
Okay, can you hear me well?
Yep.
Cool. Just a second. Three, two, one. I wanted to deal with three things which came up from closing opposition. The firstly, the knife accusation, and I want to be very clear. Firstly, we didn't assume what youth will do and where youth will stay, but we literally analyzed for 3 minutes why politicians will have incentive to apply to them regardless, but also how that changed the incentives from existing political parties, which top half never talk about that or never prove why this is likely scenario or why this is majority scenario in majority of the context. Second of all, we are talking about the completely different population than opening government. Why they're limiting their case by saying what they assert the youth will do and where they will go. We are saying what is the likely counterfactual where the most youth people will join to the existing party, why they will do this, but also why this is something which we are seeing on a daily basis. Therefore, on the quantity, but also on the likelihood scenario in majority of the context, on the average, we are more in the debate. So claiming the knife, it's unjustified from closing opposition. Second of all, I think they strawman our case and they missed the preemptive response to their extension, which Hadar gave in the second point of extension. I want to be very clear. Their extension is about the democracy and about the rules and how that's function better on their side of the house. They never actually explain how the real politics in terms of democracy, what are the incentives of people staying in power, and what kind of power the youth have while joining there. When they are saying that democracy only function with free and fair election, we told you why the awareness, informed choice, critical thinking, and respect to the other minorities and listening to people are taken down in the echo chambers when the youth creating their own parties. This is direct response to saying that in the future, these people will be less likely to participate in the democratic process, but also that you antagonize people against each other, especially if you buy the opening opposition characterization that these groups compete within each other, but also to proving who will get the most power and claim about the democracy, it's completely unproven in the debate and clashing with our extension. The second, I think, important note, it's a lot of democracy functioning. It depends who is in power and how these people give you space or how they will apply to your needs. Therefore, we gave you strong analysis why on our side of the house, the politicians will do that better because they will apply to people who are not yet involved in politics or not yet have strong opinions, which is also something which opposition will completely ignore in this debate. And here is important piece of framing from Hadar, which I think that need to be considered in this debate. The people who are joining these types of parties, the young wings, that's not people who want to be informed or who are like reading once in the news and they're like, I want to know more about politics. That people who are prompted by probably their peers around them, maybe their parents or maybe some kind of classes or maybe some kind of activities, and they already have strong opinion. Because only people who want to dedicate themselves, who link their identity to the particular cause, are capable to spend a lot of time on the political activities, but also linking their future to this and depends all of their actions, especially when a lot of young people, which they try to impact on opposition to getting more information, are much more likely to get that on our side of the house without being indoctrinated and without being prompted by people around them, which will make that the personal battle and prompting their own pride or their own ability. I think this is extremely important. Then they said, but youth people are important because they are more believe that change will happen. But they also believe in change in particular view, right? A lot of young people have very radical views neither on left or neither right side that make them less likely to compromise with establishment. So even if these young people participate in discourse, it's extremely hard to find the consensus which also opposition rely on to create better democracy or better situation. So let's talk about opening opposition and their main metric in this debate. On which side of the house, the youth politics, it's better, or like healthier participation? Because I think they never explained what the word healthier in politics means. Versus, I think Hadar gave us the structural analysis, how people who are youth and joining echo chambers have different perception on politics and the different people around them. Comparatively, you can still have these people being incentivized to join to the politics because they are important groups of voters, because they are important swing voters which in the next 4 or 5 years will still stay in the voting voters base, engage some people being re-elected, the people who are talking about environmental issues, the people who are talking about the future pensions funds, etc. Therefore, the youth politics better. It's not only the people who are already established political views, but the people who we want to encourage to join to the political parties. And it's really hard to do this from the bottom to the top. Compare when you incentivize people in the top who need these people to help them to exist in the discourse to join there. Therefore, I think if we are talking about healthier participation, but also increasing participation based on the quantity and the vulnerability of the group, or making the actual data and the actual change, that's the extension which we provide you in this debate. And second of all, about looking better, I think this metric I fulfilled when I responded to all of the democracy claims coming from closing opposition. I will give a chance to engage, but 15 seconds, please.
The Brexit vote and the Democrats losing in 2016 is evidence of apolitical young people often not turning out to vote. So deal with the possibility of political apathy and alienation on your side when there is no relatable face or resonant narrative within the political system.
Yeah. So here's the thing. Your example is not evidence. That's the first thing. Second of all, you are talking about status quo in which this is able. We are talking about the change about abolish. So if this is evidence, not example, that still play on our side of the house to our case, how we can change things. So let's talk a bit about the top half more and what's happened there. I think it's extremely important to include to this debate the most powerful actors, which are the current existing political parties, when you don't need to create all of these structures, but just to impact and change people approach and participation, which we provide you second of all. But more important, even if we buy what all of the teams want in this debate, for youth to be better, for them to be heard, for them to participate in politics, their preferences will be reflected in the way which already can be included to political parties' programs, when they don't need to wait if they win election or if they will be heard or like in the particular spectrum, right? Therefore, our case, it's more on average. Second of all, based on the actual analysis of real politics and how political parties, voters, and young people function, therefore, we are proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech. To end this debate, I would like to call the Op Whip.
Sorry, Tasia, can you just give us a minute? Sean has to go and get the door for someone.
Oh, okay, sure.
Hi, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Give me a moment. Right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to prove two things in this debate. First, I want to explain why we better empower youths to create change. Second, I want to explain why we better increase the reach of democracy, and that's a good thing. First, on empowering youths. I want to take out opening government from this debate first, because I think the burden of opening government was to prove that alternative youth parties starting from scratch have either the clout or the electoral engine to create change. If you look at all of the impacts that opening government gave you, they all rely on this premise being proven, that your small party has enough clout to change the discourse radically, that enough people are going to vote for them, that bigger political parties must care about their particular interests and care about their particular views. And if you listen to them very carefully, that's a premise that they never actually prove. It also clashes with the setup that they gave you, that young people have no money and therefore no ability to immediately create change. The conclusion that you draw of the opening government case, therefore, should be this. They can claim the impact that young people have a safe space to talk among themselves in this separate political party. What they cannot claim is two things. One, why this specific implication of being able to talk in a safe space cannot similarly exist in a youth wing that is distinct from the rest of the general population within the party. Two, they cannot explain that talking in a separate safe space is likely to create any degree of social change at the end of the day. Because they don't explain, therefore, why this talking separately is uniquely important, even if it doesn't create the change that they want. I don't think that opening government has a foot stand in this debate. Let's deal with closing. I'll take a PY in a while after I deal with you. The closing argument is youth need to create change by speaking within the General Assembly. And you need to notice that this mechanism is actually directly antithetical to the stuff that was said in opening government. Like, I'm not saying that CG takes a fourth because of this. I just think that they cannot advance together in this particular round. But look, the problem is that even if I believe that the general community is the debate, they don't prove to you why in the General Assembly you are able to get a significant degree of change in closing government, right? Enqi tells you that it's highly unlikely that they're going to be able to go in and speak, partly because of the reasons that opening government gives, but also stuff that she tells you in her speech. One, she tells you that they're likely to feel incredibly shut out because the comparative is this. In the General Assembly, the youths are several disparate individuals in a broader social group, in a broader social assembly. That doesn't give them the ability to feel like they have a significant degree of involvement or a significant degree of unity or a safe space within that particular assembly to speak their views, especially given the frame that opening sets out about how this is likely to be dominated, the General Assembly is likely to be dominated by large majorities. But second, Enqi tells you that even if you believe that these individuals have a say, they are likely to be very individualized in nature within that General Assembly that closing government wants to talk about, which means that they never get to coalesce into having a significant enough critical mass to exert pressure on the powers that be within the party. That means that it's highly unlikely that their change of speaking within the General Assembly is going to come true. She tells you a comparative that I think got completely ignored by the government whip speaker. She told you that change in the party uniquely happens when you have a youth wing to compete and debate with the General Assembly of the party. And she gives you three important reasons. First, she tells you that because the youth wing is within the party, there isn't an inherent adversarial nature that will exist on the comparative where you exist outside the party, for example, as opening government wants to claim. The greater willingness to engage with that party on good terms because you have the same outcome of trying to stay in power is the reason you're likely to listen to them. Second, she tells you that you are a clear voting bloc within the general discussion. At the point that the youth has the ability to unify on a stance before the general discussion, the youth are therefore better able to exert pressure because they have a clear view and they have a clear bloc that is able to stand together and vote against the powers that be at a point that those in power aren't working in favor of the youth. The comparatives that you don't know whether you have this voting bloc, it's harder for you to organize meaningfully, especially if they don't want an alternative informal youth wing on closing government, which means that you don't get the degree of ability to change within the political spectrum. But third, because when you have a unified youth wing, the older people know that this wing will grow in influence and therefore they have more of an incentive to listen. All of these mechanisms mean that up against the single response from GovWit that it depends how the older people in the party give space. Enqi uniquely explained to you why the youth wing is the way that we force these old people to give space. We create incentive structures for them to give space. And that's how we thought we created change. The final thing I want to deal with from closing government is this claim that there's going to be indoctrination. Two responses. The first is that the comparative is unclear on that side of the house. It seems to be more likely that they're going to also be indoctrinated in the general discussion at a point that they're just some isolated individuals that don't have the ability to band together. The comparative is that when you have a distinct space within the party, i.e. a youth wing, you are better able to find this indoctrination because there isn't this direct route for the top to the people within the youth wing. But the worst case scenario is not something they prove, which is that having a mind change is not necessarily a harm. In fact, it is the premise of the democratic process. So I don't see why this is such a big problem. How does all this weigh against opening opposition? They told you two things. The first thing they said is that they want to groom you for succession. At best, this is an incredibly long-term argument that also increases the likelihood of this indoctrination claim in closing government coming around, because you are bound to the people who are at the top that select you for succession. This doesn't exist against the CO argument, because CO's argument is that you have the ability to speak up within the General Assembly, and therefore, even if the older people don't like you, it doesn't matter because you get a say, you have a voting bloc that matters. But second, they told you about the youth vote. The reality is that to the degree we agree the youth vote is smaller, it is unlikely that they're going to create change. But we also think that we exclusively gave you the analysis to how we empower and attract the youth vote. Before that closing.
Our mechanisms include youth talking to their peers outside of the party, politicians going to universities to talk rather than the youth wings, parties supporting policies that majority of youth likes to cater to them, etc. None of those is contingent on youth continuing to vote for the same parties, even if this was somehow the same group, ignoring the fact we talk about a different stakeholder than OG.
Yeah, I'm getting there, but I just want to point out that there is also non-responsive to the material that we give you in closing opposition. So just purely on engagement, I think we've done a lot more to your extension than you have. Second argument, how do we increase the reach of democracy? The argument that they just peel at me is this idea of changing behavior. They talk about things like jargon that need to change. The first thing to note is that if there is an incentive to win the youth on both sides, it is unclear why this incentive would not similarly exist in a world with or without youth wings. But here's what we uniquely told you. Insofar as you want to cater to the youth wings are the way in which you do that, because we told you that the youth wings give the capability to change behavior, because you have clear signaling from a group of people within your party who can come together and tell the older people what the youth want, which means that you are better able to cater to this youth. You're better able to change jargon, for example, if that's what they want to talk about, because you have the clear signaling from within your party on how you should strategize and how you should behave. But secondly, NC tells you that youth wings critically empower these traditional parties, especially those that have not been as dominant, because you have the ability to fight the sheer degree of entrenched money that exists in the status quo with the youth empowerment, without the baggage of being uniquely young or having no clear narrative, which is the problem with the opening government mechanism. Therefore, if this debate is about engaging the youth, we better do that with the mechanism of having a youth